Welcome to the keynote speech, conferencia magistral, of this joint conference between ISA and AMEI. We propose Dr. Andrea Oelsner as a keynote speaker because her research deals with very relevant topics in international relations, such as friendship in international relations, security communities, and peace. She is professor of IR and director of IR and political science degrees at the Universidad de San Andrés in Argentina. She is also an associate editor of the ISA journal Foreign Policy Analysis, board member of the World International Studies Committee, WISC, and served as a member of ISA's James Rosenau Award Committee. She has published 3 books: International Relations in Latin America, Peace and Security in 𝐂𝐧𝐼𝐶, published by Routledge, and with 2 editions, and Global Thinkers of Peace, Latin American Nobel Peace Prizes, published by Palgrave and Macmillan, and also Friendship and International Relations, also published by Palgrave. Particularly the book about Latin American thinkers of peace, in my opinion, is an essential reading for Latin American students and scholars in our IR programs. It's very important that they know who they are. And it's unforgivable that our Mexican students don't know about Alfonso Garcia Robles and his proposal for a nuclear weapons-free zone in Latin America. The kind of diplomatic proposals that the current world needs today. Please, Professor Andrea.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Adriana, for your very kind presentation, introduction, and thank you, AMEI and ISA for this invitation. Thank you to 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝒂𝒂𝒄, my friend, colleague, and colleague who has helped me edit this presentation today. And thank you all for being here and being here with me the next 45 minutes or so. I knew I had a problem here with my presentation. It was my glasses. Anyway, so the conference theme is Positioning Latin America and Mexico in International Relations. And when I was invited to do this keynote address, I was given leeway to link my talk to this broad theme as I wished. What a challenge, I thought. But after pausing for a moment, I decided that rather than presenting on a single piece of research, an elaborate product, whether finished or in progress, I would rather tackle this address by building a collage on my research agenda more broadly. I learned while doing this, that both a collage and a patchwork involve making a larger design from recognizable individual pieces. The difference between them lies that in that patchwork, it requires sewing fabric pieces together, and you would still be able to see the seams and the stitches. So I won't try to hide that this presentation is made of a few pieces, but hopefully it goes seamless and it still makes sense as one single argument. This is what I plan to do. I plan to begin by discussing what for many is the sudden death of the liberal international order. I mean, how could I avoid the elephant in the room? And given that all of us in this room with the elephant are IR students and scholars, I don't think that too many of us think that this is really a case of sudden death. I think, and hopefully you share this with me, that this is rather the case of the chronicle of a death foretold, crónica de una muerte anunciada. After this, I will discuss the consequences of the crisis of disorder for international politics, on international politics, in particular on international security and conflict. And then I will zoom in and assess the state of violence in Latin America. And in the final part, and because as I go, you will realize that it is not a fun topic, but I would like to end on a more optimistic note. I will build upon the findings of the book Thinkers of Peace that you were mentioning, that I co-edited in 2023, and I will explore the space for a Latin American contribution to international peace and security by discussing the established tradition of peaceful conflict resolution in Latin America and the diversity of peace activists, peace jurists, peace builders who came out of this region and can be considered peace role models. So let's dive in. I said that I would discuss the crisis of the liberal international order first. And what I would like to argue is that we are not dealing here with a recent crisis. Indeed, different from the end of the Cold War that took many IR scholars and world leaders by surprise, I think that not too few of us have been observing the problems of the liberal international order now for many years. As a matter of fact, soon after the end of the Cold War, that is, soon after what was called the end of history and the triumph of the liberal order, and of course I put this in quotation marks, Stanley Hoffman published his 1995 foreign policy article called The Crisis of the Liberal Order, The Crisis of Liberal Internationalism. In it, Hoffman argued that there had been too many tensions and contradictions during the Cold War period that would prevent us from talking about a Cold War liberalism. And I quote, Hoffman said, "Liberal internationalism had to rely on partial rather than global institutions for cooperation, on military alliances such as NATO, or on a hegemon." For him, an order closer to liberal internationalism lasted only from Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s until the first Gulf War in 1990. Thus, in historical terms, liberal internationalism was just a moment. In this line, I would like to say that indeed, the liberal international order that emerged after the Second World War was never too ordered, too liberal, or too international. To say that it offered order, and I may be playing here with the meaning of order, the Spanish meaning of order, orden, which is synonymous with both tidiness and stability. To say that it offered order just because there was no kinetic traditional war between the superpowers underestimates how close the world was, at least twice, to a nuclear catastrophe during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis and the 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm incident. You would also need to forget the numerous violent conflicts in the world's periphery during the Cold War, whether in Asia, the Middle East, or Latin America. It would also be a stretch to say that this order was liberal. Latin America experienced US support for US and European support, really, for friendly dictatorships with terrible consequences. It would be fair to say that the liberal values of democracy and human rights were not a priority beyond the North Atlantic area. Precisely because of that, it's difficult to state that the liberal order was international, or at least not global. Ultimately, the features of liberal and of order covered a rather limited geographical space in the world. With the end of the Cold War, realism speaks of the unipolar moment. We know it by heart, don't we? For realists, unipolarity cannot last but a moment because international politics is a system always seeking equilibrium or balance of power. A unipolar world is a system out of balance. So the so-called triumph of the liberal order was based on three pillars: free trade and globalization, democracy and the rule of law, and multilateralism. Many have called the immediate post-Cold War the global age of liberalism. Yet already in 1999, there were massive anti-globalization demonstrations in Seattle, where a summit of the World Trade Organization was taking place, signaling early problems and dissatisfaction with this first pillar, free trade and globalization. In March 2003, the second Gulf War began in Iraq. Already that same year, there were reports of human rights abuses by American soldiers in the Abu Ghraib prison, and a few years later by British soldiers in the secret detention camp in Basra, both in Iraq. The documented abuses involved torture, physical, psychological, and sexual abuses, rape, sodomy, and war crimes. All this took place precisely there where the West had forcefully gone in to bring about democracy and human rights, liberalism's second pillar. Finally, the third pillar is multilateralism, which was frequently marginalized. For instance, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the UN Secretary General from 1992 to 1997, paid with his position for his criticism of the US and Britain. Though he was able to rebuild his relationship with Britain, with the US, it remained frail to the point that the United States was the only permanent member of the Security Council unilaterally exercising its veto power when Boutros-Ghali sought re-election as Secretary General. Between 1993 and 1999, the US imposed or threatened with unilateral economic sanctions 60 times on 35 states. Back then, this represented 40% of the world's population. It also put pressure on friends and allies to join them without a UN vote. After the 9/11 attacks in 2001, unilateralism became more frequent. The invasion of Iraq by a coalition led by the United States was declared illegal by the United States, the multilateral organ par excellence. That was soon followed by George W. Bush taking the USA out of the Kyoto Protocol and the International Criminal Court. In other words, this trend of weakening the liberal order is not the product of Trump 1 or Trump 2, but in the present is made worse by a multiplicity of additional challenges faced by the liberal international order. Just to name a few: the Chinese economic and power growth, Russian revisionism, the rise of global South states dissatisfied with the Western dissatisfied with the Western order, and the frustration of important sectors of society within the central states, which explains the success of populist and illiberal leaders. Of course, Trump, his style, his ideas, his nationalism, his nativism, and his foreign policy agenda accelerate and deepen the crisis. The challenges come thus not just from out with. Out with is a lovely little Scottish word that means from outside, but also from inside of the liberal order. We could imagine a future American government reverting trade and industrial protectionism. Okay. We could imagine a future American government reverting trade and industrial protectionism and recovering a more empathetic and solidaristic foreign policy by reestablishing aid programs, for instance. A future government could return to the international organisms and treaties from which it withdrew, like the World Health Organization and the environmental treaties. It could also seek to renew its international hegemony. Though difficult as all this is, there is something that is even more difficult to reconstruct, and that is the trust of former allies and friends. And I tap here on my research on international friendship. Basically, after the Second World War, the US led other states on an ambitious and long-term enterprise, together with European powers, with Western Europe, Canada, Japan, and other countries. The United States strengthened a community of shared values, of compatible political ideals, of international institutions and mutual support within those institutions, of open, integrated, and interdependent trade and economic models. The United States offered security and even nuclear security guarantees during the Cold War and also in the post-Cold War. All this has allowed for the growth of mutual confidence, trust, and I think that this is important, and a shared vision of the future among partners, allies, and friends. In the last few months, Trump's highly personal and volatile style has rapidly eroded the country's credibility in the eyes of those friendly states. As you are likely to intuitively suspect, and research indeed confirms, credibility and trust are much more easily and rapidly destroyed than they are constructed. And if that's the case, to reconstruct destroyed trust is even more difficult than constructing it for the first time. So here we are, in an even less rules-based order than before, where bullying, which may not be a very scientific term, and still it is bullying, personalism, and perhaps spheres of influence become the new normal. What is the impact of liberalism's retreat, even from the center of the world, on international peace and security? If so far I have argued that the erosion of the liberal order is not new, then the impact of its erosion on international peace and security should show also as a trend rather than as abrupt change. And it does. But I will start from a little behind here, from a little earlier. I find it useful to divide the analysis of international security since the Cold War in 4 periods. In this way, both the particular features as well as the continuities across periods can be identified. focusing on the continuities will show the limitations of an analysis of analyzing the global North and the global South as two separate security systems or subsystems. I argued earlier that during the Cold War, the liberal system was more ordered in one part of the world, as in no violent conflict or war, and there was plenty of violence and war on the margins of the system. Furthermore, the end of the Cold War ideological dispute between global superpowers brought visibility back to regional dynamics of security and insecurity. Some authors, Barry Buzan and Weaver, etc., then observed a certain interdependence of security within regions, as well as certain independence or isolation between regions. They call that the regional security complex theory. Moreover, other authors contrasted a violent and disorderly global South with an orderly and peaceful global North. However, the connections of the ordered North and the disordered South are complex and run much deeper than the binary global North, global South distinction allows for. Even the categorization of global North and South is very problematic, but you have to choose your battles, and the battle of misleading categories is not that I can fight today. Instead, I will pose that the global South has historically been the stage, the space for conflicts that have transcended regions. Trans-regional connections and interdependencies have always been present. The security of the South and the North, as well as the East and the West, have remained profoundly interconnected since the end of the Second World War. In terms of international security, I said that I found useful to identify 4 periods, and these 4 periods go from the end of the 4 periods go. The first period is the Cold War, 1945-1991. The immediate post-Cold War, 1991-2001. The era of the global war on terror, 2001-2011. And the 4th period, which extends from the US and UK withdrawal from Iraq in 2011 to the present, which also coincides with the beginning of the Arab Spring in 2011. This will highlight continuities rather than breaks, in line with the previous analysis on the crisis of the liberal international order. So very briefly, I will offer a few thoughts on each of these stages. We will see that conflicts have different predominant characteristics in each of these stages, and the linkages between North and South are also distinct. However, there is much continuity and commonality. Okay. I have a few drawings to share. So the first period, the Cold War, 1945-1991. During the Cold War, intra and interstate armed conflict proliferated almost exclusively in the global South, generally with a strong ideological basis. In the global North, however, the same ideological competition for power and global supremacy between the United States and the Soviet Union remained contained and precisely cold. Even so, the existence of spheres of influence, nuclear umbrellas, ideological penetration, external military intervention in local conflicts, and proxy wars fueled by the superpowers inextricably bound the North and the South. I said the second period was the first decade of the post-Cold War era. During this period, ideological conflict gave way to the spread of intrastate conflicts driven predominantly by identity. The novelty of the end of bipolarity allowed for the relative isolation of an optimistic North, the end of history and the triumph of liberalism. The North became isolated from the ethnic and religious conflicts in the global South. However, the war in the Balkans, the conflicts in Central Asia, and the active participation of European and North American countries in United Nations missions until the mid-1990s brought the North and the South together again. Although the personnel contributions of Western Europe and North America to UN peacekeeping operations declined abruptly in 1996, many of the ethnic conflict of this period had their origins in European imperialism, colonialism, and decolonization. The next period is the so-called War on Terror that goes from 2001 to 2011. It began after the 9/11 attacks of 2001, just as earlier, but again differently, the insecurity of the North and the South once again became intertwined in an inescapable interdependence. The direct involvement of central powers such as the United States and Great Britain contributed to the most visible violence being located predominantly in Iraq and Afghanistan and the surrounding regions. During these three periods, violent conflicts were predominantly located in the global South, although the use of force often originated in northern dynamics, as during the Cold War, and/or involved northern intervention, as in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. In each period, resorting to war failed to build a lasting or just peace. Think of Korea and Vietnam during the Cold War. Think of Somalia and Rwanda in the immediate post-Cold War. Think of Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11. So the fourth and final period begins in 2011 with the withdrawal of the US and British troops from Iraq and the gradual US disengagement from Afghanistan, which was completed at the beginning of the Biden administration. As I said, it also coincides with the beginning of the Arab Spring. After 2011, global conflicts began to increase in number. No? No sure. ¿Sí? No veo ahí. Okay. So hopefully, I don't see it, but hopefully you're seeing there a chart that shows that after 2011, the number of conflicts starts to increase rapidly. This other slide, no? It's very counterintuitive. Do we have something? I don't have anything there yet, right? Una más? Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. This shows the same, but in global terms. But it discerns by type of violence, by region. In the global South, especially in Africa and Latin America, the growth in the number of conflicts have been more significant than in the rest of the world. Alarmingly, the trend of violence in the Americas displays the steadiest and fastest growth. We'll get there in a few moments. This other chart, let me see. This other chart shows the period beginning in 2011 and is the one producing the highest shows that the period beginning in 2011 is the one producing the highest number of annual deaths since the end of the Cold War, with the exception of 1994, which is the year of the Rwandan genocide. Although during this last of our fourth period, conflicts began to change their character, not although, also during this period, conflicts began to change their character. A new global geopolitics, most clearly observable in Africa and Asia, has been built upon the institutional fragility of some states and their pre-existing conflicts. Especially, but not exclusively in the global south, the ensuing protracted violence has been exacerbated by the consequences of natural disasters, climate change, and pandemics, which find these vulnerable, fractured, and impoverished states without adequate infrastructure, institutions, and policies to deal with them, thus superimposing an additional dimension to conflicts and the dynamics of security and insecurity. I have chosen not to go into detail about each region and the challenges they face, partly because many of these have been discussed or will be discussed tomorrow in valuable panels in this conference. But I would like to invite reflection upon the following. Being able to identify one concrete and single enemy behind different groups has kept Western powers engaged. Instead, the decentralization and localization of the sources and also of the reach of the threat, which comes from more local and less global, at least less visible in the West, may partly explain the increasing disinterest and disengagement by the international community. Take, for example, the crisis in Sudan. I'm sure you have heard of it, but how much do you know about the crisis in Sudan? Estimates say that well over 150,000 casualties this crisis has taken, and there are 20 million internally displaced persons, most of them 16 million children, women and children. And compared with the attention that the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza have received, although in these cases, I could argue that this is not necessarily the global south, that they are not necessarily global south problems. The war between Russia and Ukraine can be interpreted as a conflict between Russia and the West. Until recently, the war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas crystallized the competition between the United States / the West and Iran. Brackets. I think that this may no longer be the case. These are not proxy wars. These are not new Cold War, but rather symptoms that reveal the depth, scope, and reach of the West, of a West in decline, their location on the margins of the global North, as well as their strategic magnitude, make them more visible, of more interest to powers, and more easily and more quickly regionalizable and even globalizable. These wars have had a major impact on the deterioration of relations between powers and have further weakened questionable international conflict resolution mechanisms. Even for the cases of internal, local, and sub-regional conflicts, the UN, with its vast experience in mediation and peacekeeping mechanisms, appears discredited and defunded. In general terms, conflicts in the era of weakening liberalism exhibit three common features. They are longer, they last for longer than in the past. There we go. They last longer than in the past, especially intrastate conflicts. If they are deemed part of the power's national interest, they tend to acquire an international dimension, and both the number of conflicts and the number of victims are on the rise. So to summarize so far, first, as in previous periods, even when conflicts in the global south respond to local dynamics of violence, it is not possible to isolate them from extra-regional dynamics that transcend them. Some conflicts inherit elements of the global war on terror. Others are exacerbated by climate change and natural disasters caused primarily by the industrialization and pollution of the North. They may also be fueled by demand coming from outside of the region for illicit products, inducing the establishment of local connections of transnational crime organization. Either way, the security of the global North and the global South remains intertwined and mutually reinforcing. However, political capacity, especially political will, by the international community to participate collectively in efforts to resolve conflicts have diminished. Second, conflict weakens state institutions. In some states and some regions, power vacuums are more severe than in others, but even in the global North, the resilience of democratic and constitutional models of governance faces significant challenges, as evidenced by the 2021 assault on the US Capitol, and even more recent examples could be named too. Third, and related to the above, state fragility is measured by taking into account economic, environmental, political, security, societal, and human dimensions. Both in the North and the South, combinations of these dimensions appear threatened, contributing to institutional fragility. Far from being a characteristic exclusive to countries in the global South, anti-democratic, populist, nativist, nationalist discourses are spreading in the United States and in Central and Western European countries, and in South America, or Latin America in general, thus contributing to the erosion of the social fabric and the legitimacy of the rule of law. Finally, at the global level, the loss of trust in and legitimacy of multilateral conflict resolution mechanisms results in disputes escalating more rapidly and becoming more violent. The irrelevance or absence of global governance structures leaves conflicting parties with fewer opportunities and incentives to seek an alternative to violence, or at least to moderate it. So I said that I would say a few things about Latin America. Latin America, in this context, Latin America has often been defined as a zone of interstate peace. In comparison to other regions of the global South, Latin America can be called a zone of peace. The comparison is striking. Africa, for example, is the continent with the highest number of armed conflicts and also the highest number of recent coups d'etat and attempted coups. By contrast, Latin America has been the region with the fewest peacekeeping operations and personnel deployed in its territory, only after the North American region, which has had none. Latin America has also been the second lowest military budget after Africa. Moreover, there are no nuclear forces or chemical or biological threats. There are no issues with the control of conventional weapons and new technologies. This reflects significant progress for a region compared to the 1970s, when a checkerboard logic dominated, hostile neighbors allied with enemies of their enemies. To explain the low incidence of wars, even during periods of heightened regional geopolitical competition, 𝐂𝐻𝐬𝐧𝐿 highlights adherence to regional norms of peace and security. After the implementation of the principle of utis possidetis iuris on the then newly decolonized territories, a long-standing tradition of consensual principles and rules of acceptable behavior followed. Part of this peaceful tradition are the multiple confidence and security building mechanisms established since the 1990s by different countries in the region. There is also the creation of ABAC, which commits Argentina and Brazil to periodic mutual inspections in the most sensitive security area, the nuclear area. There is also the promotion of the regional implementation of Resolution 1540 of 2004 and various multilateral export control regimes covering everything from military, nuclear, chemical, and biological materials to delivery systems. Today, the absence of armed disputes and the threat of interstate force remains the norms in the region. There are exceptions, however. In 2023, Venezuela revived a century-old territorial claim over the Essequibo region of Guyana and expanded its territory, its military bases to the border. Colombia captured Rodrigo Granda in Venezuela in 2005, and in 2008 entered Ecuadorian territory to capture Raúl Reyes. David Marrs describes this as a violent peace to emphasize the nature of interstate relations in Latin America. Marrs notes that in 1995, the conflict between Peru and Ecuador escalated to the level of war, that regional disputes have frequently become militarized, and that recurrent armed races occur because violence was used as a bargaining tool in the region. Today, however, the vast majority of Latin American security issues fall under the category of crime and organized crime, various trafficking, primarily drugs, but also environmental, natural and mineral resources, human trafficking, arms trafficking, kidnappings and extortion, and gangs. These types of threats have at least 3 dimensions that, when combined, allow them to be classified as security threats rather than simply as crime. And then I'm going to say a few things about each of them. The first dimension is extreme violence and large number of deaths. The second is its transnational nature. And the third is the pursuit and promotion of the weakening of state institutions. All this generates political conditions of a vacuum of legitimate power, instability, and fragility. So the first is extreme violence and death. Unlike non-state armed groups in other regions, in Latin America, these are not groups pursuing political ends or competing for access to the state apparatus. They do not fight for the control of a territory over which they claim sovereignty, nor for the recognition of communal rights. Instead, these groups are driven by the pursuit of illicit economic gain, which leads them to dispute control of territory and clash both among themselves and with state forces. The scale of their criminal activity and the violence deployed have raised the region's homicide rate to the highest in the world. No. This is from 2021. It hasn't improved since. Furthermore, the region dominates the rankings of the world's most dangerous cities. In particular, Mexican cities occupied 7 spots in this unenviable top 10. And overall, Latin American and Caribbean cities occupy 9 out of 10. Interestingly, violence continues to rise despite regional improvements on poverty rates. The next is transnationality. Responding on the demand in the most lucrative markets, predominantly in the global north, non-state armed groups built regional, transnational, and global networks to increase their profits and find illicit trade routes. This leads to the spillover of their activities beyond state borders. It also leads to processes of mergers, internationalization, and ruptures, generally shrouded in violence. Thus, in recent years, drug trafficking and the accompanying levels of violence have grown in countries such as Argentina, Ecuador, and Paraguay, which had long remained on the fringes of drug production and major drug routes. Another transnational consequence of the violence caused by armed groups is the displacement, often on foot, to neighboring countries and to the United States of hundreds of thousands of people, especially young people, fleeing gangs in Central America and Venezuela. Migrants from South America, the Caribbean, a significant number of them come from Haiti, and even Angola, Bangladesh, and Pakistan also seek to leave behind contexts of poverty, political instability, or persecution, natural disasters, and the challenges of climate change. To achieve this, they cross one of the most dangerous areas on the planet, the Darien Gap, located between Colombia and Panama, where the human trafficking industry flourishes as the number of migrants increases. In 2023, 520,000 people embarked on this often fatal journey. The third dimension refers to the weakening of democratic, political, and governance institutions in the states and regions where these criminal activities are most prevalent. From this perspective, these are political actors who aim to infiltrate and undermine the structures of the state, of legitimate territorial control, and of state governance. Although their objectives are not ideological, but rather material, the effects of institutional weakening and the fragility of governments affect all aspects of political and social life in the region. As in Colombia, also in a highly militarized state like Venezuela, today there are areas of the country and even neighborhoods within Caracas to which state authority have no access because they are controlled by gangs and armed groups. Furthermore, the type of security threats and the type of non-state violence predominating in the region gives rise to the demand for strong leaders with a firm hand. All this, of course, in quotation marks, such as Nayib Bukele in El Salvador or Daniel Noboa in Ecuador. The solutions implemented in turn generate further institutional deterioration, human rights abuses, and the violation of the separation of powers, all key dimensions of democracy. These multidimensional threats we have been discussing have the potential to generate or increase violence and even provoke interstate disputes and conflict. What could ultimately lead to regional destabilization begins with an undisputable fact. Latin America is the most unequal region in the planet and has the highest concentration of wealth, where the richest 10% of the population controls 77% of the wealth. Moreover, the increasing role that many governments assign to their armed forces in contexts and operations for which they are not prepared, such as the fight against drug trafficking, gangs, and the maras, reinforces their image, the image of the armed forces, as arbiters and last resort for resolving intrinsically political and social issues. In Latin America, these developments occur in a context of a recent past in which the use of violence against civilians was the norm, with a history ranging from state repression to human rights violations and the murder of citizens on the part of the state. Latin America has a deeply violent history that ought not to be repeated. While traditional coups d'etat do not appear to be an imminent threat in the region, the deterioration of the democratic quality contributes to the erosion of state institutions. So the future looks bleak, doesn't it? In this rather discouraging context, some Latin American experiences could contribute to finding alternative solutions to the current violent situations. In general, conflict resolution in Latin America did not depend directly on the intervention of the United Nations, that is, the international community understood in a traditional sense, nor on the intervention of an external power, especially the United States, the power with the greatest influence in the region. On the contrary, the implementation of multilateral or minilateral proposals with strong regional participation, supported, yes, but not centered upon the UN or the Organization of American States, has repeatedly proved a greater tendency to show progress. That said, it is necessary to recognize that not all of these experiences were positive. The Lima Group, formed in 2017, failed to find a peaceful solution to the crisis in Venezuela. However, several instances of regional political engagement did have successful results. That is the case, for example, of the resolution of the civil wars in Central America during the 1980s, which involved significant regional and international engagement. The creation of the Contadora Group in 1983, formed by Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, and Panama, sought to promote Central American peace and to exclude the participation of the United States. This was a purely regional initiative, although it also received support from the Organization of American States and from the UN and from the Contadora support group formed by Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Ecuador, which was created to back and strengthen the efforts of the Contadora group. The Esquipulas peace process, facilitated by the Organization of American States, were negotiated. The Esquipulas peace accords were negotiated on the foundations laid by the Contadora group. A similar approach was taken to resolve the conflict between Ecuador and Peru after the last armed clash in 1995. Following more than 50 years of border dispute in the CENEPA region, the countries accepted the diplomatic mediation by Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and the United States. In this case, too, neither the United Nations nor the Organization of American States played a leading role. They acted as observers, providing moral and logistical support. Part of the success of this negotiation lay in identifying mutual benefits and shared gains. Johan Galtung's proposal to create a binational zone of peace and development in the Cordillera del Cóndor which was the area under dispute, served as the foundation for negotiating the peace in the Brasilia Treaty. This proposal encouraged Peru and Ecuador to jointly manage and develop resources in the area, thus fostering economic cooperation and building mutual trust. The creation, I mentioned this already, but the creation of the Brazilian-Argentine Agency for Accounting and Control of Nuclear Material, the so-called ABAC, is another example of how countries with a history of rivalry over leadership and nuclear technology management were able to overcome hostility and find cooperative solutions based on mutual oversight. In all these cases, countries from the region, supported but not directed by multilateral organizations, helped open up alternative paths that proved to be more durable and solid than those previously attempted. Just as then, it may be fruitful today to promote the involvement of regional actors genuinely committed to resolving violent conflicts. Well, it could be argued that the support of the broader international community, like the UN, lends greater legitimacy to the process. In the current context of multilateral crisis, the participation of fewer but more committed actors, such as neighboring states that fear spillover across their borders, may be a more reasonable path forward. And with this, I end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrea. Now I will open the floor for your questions and comments. We have a microphone available for the questions. We will take this question. Please say your name and institution before your question. We have here, yeah.
Well, Professor Oelsner, thank you so much for that tour de force. I'm Juan Cole at the University of Michigan. I'm a Middle East expert. I just want to assert the primacy of my region for violence. I don't know for sure, but I think that the statistics that you gave for Mexico and other countries having the highest murder rates, and you showed Iraq and Syria and so forth as much paler colors. maybe it's worth looking for because political killings are not classed as homicides in the reports that those countries send to the UN. And to my surprise and dismay, I've found that the international bodies, the World Bank and the UN and so forth, don't second guess or double check whatever the governments tell them. So my guess is that a lot of deaths are being hidden in the statistics in this way. Likewise, the Bush administration displaced 4 million Iraqis. Half of Syrians have been displaced. Half of Sudanese have been displaced. There surely these kinds of population movements and forced homelessness and so forth. There's been a civil war in Libya. They have produced many more deaths than is being suggested. So I understand Mexico and other Latin American countries have a severe problem with the drug trade, but in the Middle East, the same thing is true. It turns out that the Syrian regime was actually a drug cartel. It was producing and selling Captagon. So sometimes the realities are dressed up in these different categories, but there is not much difference between the Assad regime and the Sinaloa cartel in the end.
Thank you. We have another question there. Professor Alberto Lozano, please. And then Professor Marcela.
Thank you. Professor, thank you for coming here to Universidad del Mar. My name is Alberto. I am from here, from Universidad del Mar. My question has to do if you see a connection between crime and deglobalization, if criminal agents, either armed groups or transnational organized criminals, are the cause or the catalyst of deglobalization in any way. If that's the case for you, how come? What's the causal mechanism?
Thank you. We will take these two questions if you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that the issue of homicides is a methodological issue, right? It's a methodological question. It's not part of my research. I don't collect this information. I just find it and use it. This in particular is from the global burden of disease. It's international institutions. I don't know. I think that regardless of how accurate they are, they show something. They show Mexico, Brazil may not be the highest in the world. South Africa is also in bright red on that map. Surely the consequences of war create all sorts of security and crime problems. The sheer vacuum of power allows for the proliferation of crime and illegal activities. We have already long studied what Mary Kaldor called the new wars, right? That is something between crime and war that is based, that sort of relies on the vacuum of power, the vacuum of state institutions, the fragility of states, and a logic of war that becomes a logic of the economy of war that becomes self-reproducing, right? And that was Mary Kaldor's argument. So I'm sure that conflict creates crime and crimes feeds on conflict. I think that even if they may not be the highest, the most violent cities or the ones with the highest homicide rates, which is really, a very sad competition to be the highest in that number. I think that this still shows a very problematic numbers and a very problematic political situation in these countries. But I take that, it may be that the numbers I use and that I find are not necessarily reflecting all the crime and all the homicides that happen in other places too, right? But thank you. Alberto, thank you. Crime and deglobalization. I would need to think about that. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure. I think that's my most sincere response to this. I think that there may be something there. Crime proliferates in a context of deglobalization, but at the same time, it relies and it grows with the globalization that has happened so far, right? The creation of transnational links and networks necessitates globalization. One of the characteristics of globalization was the cheapening, how much cheaper and faster communications and transport became or has become, right? Transnational crime relies on cheap, alternative, fast transport to move their goods as well. So it's a difficult one, I think that's a difficult one. Thank you, I'll have to think about that.
We have another question?
Brian Schmidt, Carleton University. There's a lot of parts to your talk. Let's just pretend John Eikenberry was here, liberal theorist par excellence, who's been writing about the liberal international order for 30 plus years. So you gave a very, very negative story that the crisis started much earlier than the T-man arriving, et cetera, et cetera. But Eikenberry's story is that the liberal order has been a great success, who has brought peace, who has uplifted people in poverty. And for his analysis, until recently, the crisis of the liberal international order was a crisis of success. So I just wonder how you position yourself vis-a-vis John Eikenberry on the story of the rise of the liberal international order. And I would imagine he's greatly saddened that it's coming to an end because he doesn't see good things ahead without the liberal international order, with all of its problems.
Thank you. That's also very interesting. Of course, he chooses to highlight certain aspects of the liberal international order. I choose and obscure other aspects. I choose to highlight some aspects of the liberal international order and its success or problems, and probably obscure others. I would agree with him that a liberal international order is and would be much better than an illiberal world. I think that an illiberal world is, and by the way, I also think that this is probably what we have ahead, is a much more violent, much more dangerous, much more fractured world. I only recently I started thinking that, if I had the crystal ball, which I don't have, but if I had, I think that what I see is not necessarily a multipolar world. So obviously we are not in a unipolar world anymore, and it may not have lasted very long. The unipolar moment, as the realists say, there's not going to be a bilateral world either. But I don't think it's going to be a multilateral world either. And I think it's probably, we are rather in front of a a fractured world. And a fractured world is going to be different and probably even less nice than a multipolar world. A multipolar world, there is certain underlying consensus about how to maintain order. Think, of the 100 Years of Peace in Europe. That was a multipolar order. The conference, the peace conferences in Europe, etc. I think that we are not necessarily in such a world anymore. It's not going to be multipolar, and I think that the features of a fractured world are going to be different. Perhaps many people are talking in the last few weeks, because this is something, this develops week by week as Trump's tariffs as well, right? Many people are saying, well, what Trump wants to do is create spheres of influence, and perhaps we are moving to a world of spheres of influence. And that's going to be the new order, a world of spheres of influence that would resemble a little bit, the European order of the 19th century. I'm not sure. I would like to buy 𝐈𝐭NBERRY's liberal order. I think it would be a much better world order, a much nicer world order. I think that when he says that, he chooses to obscure the violence of that was in the margins of the world. I think that he chooses to obscure that not everybody gained from the liberal order. These are all sorts of theoretical and methodological choices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrea. And to finish, I should mention that the University of San Andrés is hiring a professor of international relations. So Andrea will be available to provide more information about that. And Buenos Aires is a great place to live. So if anyone wants to apply, please do it. Okay, we have the reception outside this auditorium. Thank you very much and good evening.